Hello, I'm Janos Di-Fanteria. Welcome to Janos Di-Fanteria Reads. Over the coming months, I'll be reading selected passages from the author's novels, exploring the real history that inspired them, and occasionally taking a closer look at the extraordinary people and events behind the fiction. Everything you will hear is rooted in genuine history. My task has never been to rewrite history, but to ask what might exist just beyond the edge of what we already know. Today's reading comes from Book 1 in the Temple of Death. Our story begins during one of the greatest engineering achievements of the First World War, the Messines Ridge, the 7th of June, 1917. Last time we stood above the trenches at Messines Ridge. Today we're going underground, beneath the mud, beneath the shell fire, and beneath the chaos of the Western Front. For there another battle was being fought, a battle of silence, a battle of patience, a battle where the enemy could sometimes be heard, but seldom seen. The outcome was uncertain, even to the man who had put his name to the plan. General Herbert Plumer had said the day previously, "Gentlemen, I don't know whether we are going to change history tomorrow, but at any rate we shall alter the geography." Today's reading continues from In the Temple of Death. It's time to meet Harold Hampton. Against his better judgment, Kingsman Harold Hampton had accepted the offer from Lieutenant Gillard to babysit the tunnellers. Harold was to protect the men who had been digging a labyrinth of tunnels beneath the Messines front for nearly 2 years. Their task was extremely secret and dangerous, but skilled, and the 6 shillings a day men had earned a fearsome reputation around the front-line trenches beneath which they operated. Along the British line that stretched from Hill 60 just southeast of Ypres, or Wipers, as the soldiers called them, to Factory Farm near Plugstert Wood, or Plug Street, looking on the map like a ghostly face pushing against an invisible barrier from east to west. 20 huge mines had been primed and ready to evaporate everything above them. The concept and momentum behind such a huge undertaking originated with a rather unconventional character, who, in 1915, became notorious for touring the trenches in his Rolls-Royce, loaded with cases of port. Major John Norton Griffiths had previously earned the nickname Hellfire Jack for his devotion to the British Empire. Eccentric he might have been, but his business before the war was very much focused on the subterranean. His company were working on a contract to extend Manchester Corporation's drainage system. Norton Griffiths believed his specialist sewer drivers possessed a skill that would give the British an advantage in Flanders. The technique known as clay kicking involved a man sitting with his back supported against a wooden rest and utilising the quadriceps muscles to push a small, extremely sharp spade-like grafting tool into the tunnel face before him. The mineralogical composition beneath Flanders was almost identical to that beneath Manchester. Very heavy clay. Rather than using picks with their arms to tunnel through the clay, his men employed the far greater power of their legs. It was not only quick and efficient, but, critically for Norton Griffith's campaign, virtually noiseless. Hence, Hellfire Jack was convinced that clay kicking could be a valuable weapon on the Western Front. This type of underground warfare was a 24-hour undertaking, and the tunnels were wet, claustrophobic and hazardous. A typical team on shift would have a kicker, who extracted clay spits at the face, a bagger, who silently put the spits into sandbags, and a runner, who put the bags on a small trolley on rails that led back to the shaft. All British mine trolleys after 1916 had self-oiling bearings to reduce noise and streamline the operation, so nobody heard a thing. Filled bags were hoisted up the shaft and dumped onto the surface to provide extra protection for the men in the trenches. Working within these cramped and dangerous conditions, the clay kickers could push an average of nearly 30 feet per day. In contrast, the German tunnellers averaged 77% less in the same time frame. It was soon evident that experienced older men were best suited to this highly stressful task, as they were likely to be steadier under pressure and less likely to panic in an emergency. By mid-1916, the British had around 25,000 trained tunnellers, with almost twice that number of attached infantry working permanently alongside them, fetching and carrying the many essential mining paraphernalia, as well as pumping air and water and removing the spoil. German pioneers never used clay kicking, as it was not a technique employed in German civil engineering. Indeed, it remained unknown to them throughout the war. They continued to work with noisy pickaxes, and the enticement of 6 shillings a day, a decent wage for working men then, was a powerful incentive. By contrast, an unskilled tunneller's mate received 2 shillings and twopence, while the infantryman in the trenches pocketed a meagre 1 shilling and threepence. Harold Hampton was standing on the first level down the tunnel entrance at Spanbroek Molen. Directly ahead of him, and deep underground, beneath the German line, the huge explosive charge set by Major Henry Hudspeth almost a year before was patiently awaiting 0 hour. The Germans had been frantically countermining the British and Commonwealth tunnellers. The engineers had endured too many dangerous and costly expeditions back into the tunnels to ensure that the explosive mines were not compromised, damaged, or the wiring broken. They had to be sure that the charges would explode when they hit the plungers, heralding the attack with devastating power. Harold was at that moment facing the German front, but obviously could see nothing. It was past midnight, and he was very cold. Jack Dobson had told him it was a damn sight less uncomfortable than sitting in a support trench, contemplating and chatting with a naked flame, trying to rid your clothes of those damned lice. Plenty of time to think, he'd said, but it wasn't everyone's cup of tea. Harold now understood why. For a start, it was pissing down, and the fact that he was 50 feet underground was making little difference. He was bitterly cold and standing in a puddle, as he only had 2 or 3 feet square above the ladder that plunged into darkness on which to perch. He wasn't keen on moving around too much, as he couldn't see that well in the gloom, and was not confident that when he planted a size 9, it would stay on terra firma. Going arse over tit into a pitch-black hole wasn't a prospect he relished. Streams of freezing, filthy rainwater were pouring down his back and neck, which was proving the most uncomfortable aspect of the whole experience so far. Well, almost. There was also the dark, the whiz and crump of the artillery above him, and the expansive silence of the shaft, with only brief yet unnerving interruptions every 20 minutes or so, as the tunnellers, shuffling and scraping from down below, carried eerily up into the galleries above. A muffled shout from below ended his brief reverie. The moment was gone, and Harold was alone again. He also knew that he had to go down into the abyss and see what the trouble was. Dick Potts was on the surface post, a level above him, and despite being a few years older than Harold, he was nervous and didn't want to alarm him. No point in putting him into more of a flap. Harold slung his rifle over his left shoulder, took a deep breath, and started to descend on the rickety wooden rungs that served as a ladder. It had taken Harold only 2 minutes to descend the narrow ladder, but he was mighty glad when his feet hit the compacted earth and rough wooden slats that formed the floor on the lowest level of the Spanbrook Moorland Tunnel. Well, he was relatively glad. He was getting closer to the teeth end, some 1,070 feet ahead of Harold. Over 91,000 pounds of amatol, a mix of ammonium nitrate and TNT, was packed tightly into waterproof boxes, which were also double fused and wired back to plunger exploders on the surface. Awaiting the fateful hour when along the Messines Ridge, 19 similar tunnels were primed and ready to dissolve the ground above the Germans, who themselves had dominated this part of the line, were to be thunderously dislodged, and General Plumer's grand design would take its bloody course. Harold knew nothing of this. Just like everyone else with 2 eyes and ears, he was well aware that there was a big push about to start. But the murderous and Faustian aspects of the morning that would follow were, at this point, outside of his comprehension. He knew only two things as fact. Firstly, there were 3 clay kickers in the tunnel, accompanying 2 twitchy sapper officers armed only with pistols, a leather satchel, a flashlight, and some earphones. And secondly, he was shitting himself. Taff! Taff! What's up? It's Scouse Hampton. Are you there, Taff? Shut it, Scouse! Scouse, we've got company, came the harsh, whispered response to the question. Where's Potts? He's on top. His bottle's gone. What's up? Well, we were just helping those nice engineer officers check their wiring because we had a small cave in, and the tall daft one with the geophone set hushed us all up. And then I heard them myself. Bosh! Not more than a yard away, talking through the bloody tunnel wall. Where are they? In one of the listening posts, just there in the chamber. I came to see if I could get you down, but fell over the bloody spoil cart halfway up. Made an awful racket, mind. Mr. Gillard is putting a charge together. I heard you fall. Forget Potts for now. Let's get down there and have a shufty. Right you up. Just stay close. Watch your head. Harold swung his Lee Enfield rifle off his shoulder, and holding it in front of him at port, he took a deep breath and headed as fast as he could after the clay kicker. Neither of them could manage more than a laboured shuffle as they made off down the dark tunnel. It took them 20 harried minutes to cover 1,000 or so yards, as in the gloom Harold fell over his new companion twice as he paused to listen ahead. They could hear nothing save their hearts thumping in their chests, and the dreadful silence was only punctuated by their cursing as they stumbled on further into the gloom. At last they had reached a point at which there was a change in the atmosphere, and the tunnel stopped abruptly in front of them, branching away on both sides with no discernible end. Where the bloody hell are we, Taff? This was no more than a harsh whisper, but the question seemed to echo around them. This is the gallery, and it runs parallel to the front. The fighting tunnels and the explosives are to the right, about 50 yards, then another 200 yards forward. We nearly lost the left branch in March, but I think the main charge is safe. Jerry has been getting close. Harold had no idea of the tunnel's layout and paused nervously, crouching on one knee, listening. His senses had never been so strained. He was toiling to hear, and the poor lighting that occasional candles provided made it difficult to see more than a few yards in either direction. "Where are the sapper officers?" "The captain is checking the wiring to the main charge with Alec. Young Lieutenant Gillard has the geophone. He's up the left branch with Charlie, and he asked for you." "What, me?" "Never mind, Taff. You go and tell the captain what's happening. I'll go and see Mr. Gillard at the listening post." Harold's mind was racing. He was scared, but later he would reflect that he was calmer than he expected. Taff began to move off down the right-hand tunnel. "Wait a minute, you dozy Welsh bastard. Where's the listening post?" "Oh, sorry, Scouse," Taff said as he moved back next to him. Both men were sweating and breathing hard. His words came out, faltering, interspersed with heavy, anxious breaths. "Our left-hand tunnel, 100 yards up. You'll pass the fighting tunnel on your right. Keep going for another 50, and you'll find the post. Careful, mind. You don't want Charlie stoving your head in with a pick. Good luck. See you later." The miner hesitated and turned quickly to Harold. "Oh, listen, forgot to tell you. We have to be out of here by 2:30. "Why? What time is it?" "Taff!" "Shit!" But Taff had already moved out of earshot. "Come on, my son. Don't lose it now," Harold thought to himself as he set off up the left-hand branch of the lateral gallery. He could hear nothing ahead of him. "Charlie, it's Scouse Hampton. I came down with Taff. Where's Mr. Gillard?" Harold's whisper seemed to echo in the cold and cramped tunnel chamber. He was now close to the listening post. There are places where sound behaves badly. This was one of them. Voices travelled where men could not. Meaning arrived without a source. A man could hear something through a wall and know without understanding why that he had not merely overheard it. He had been placed in its path. A single flickering candle forced out nothing more than a tiny modicum of light, next to which crouched a small, stocky, grubby little figure that Harold knew as Charlie. The rest of his mining section knew him as Knuckles. After 2 years of digging and fighting, mostly hand-to-hand, in the claustrophobia and terror of the subterranean labyrinth that had grown beneath the trenches on the western front, he had become an expert in the use of the miner's knuckle knife. The knuckle knife was fashioned as an expedient by a Canadian officer. It was the deadly close-quarter weapon of choice of all Canadian tunnellers. It had a 5 to 6 inch blade fitted to a brass frame that went over the hand and wrist, held firmly in place with leather strapping. When a carrier's fist was clenched, the knife was at right angles to the arm, which gave the wearer greater purchase and allowed a fatal parabola across the width of a tight tunnel in hand-to-hand combat. Knuckles wore soft felt overshoes common to most of the clay kickers. These allowed the men to move through the tunnels as silently as possible, which proved a significant advantage over the Germans, who, throughout the war, continued to wear heavy, hobnailed boots. When life or death rested on knowing where tunnels and countermining spurs were being dug, as both sides struggled heroically to win the underground battle, the silence was an ally in extremis. "He's just out of the passage about 3 or 4 yards." Knuckles' voice resonated around the dank tunnel as Harold moved forward to see what the young officer wanted him. Harold could just make out the silhouette of a man on one knee, facing away from him. With 2 arms raised, outstretched, his hands pressed against the tunnel wall. The listening post was nothing more than a short spur off the main gallery, at which the young engineer officer employed the geophone set to listen for enemy workings through the clay walls. The geophone was a small listening device that could easily fit in a tunic pocket. It consisted of two wooden sensors containing mercury encased in two mica discs attached to a rudimentary doctor's stethoscope. It was efficient and easy to use, amplifying vibration. Hampton tapped the officer on the shoulder, and he turned, looking slightly startled in the gloom. "Hampton, I'm glad you made it down. We don't have much time before we prime the detonator. But I need you to listen to this." Gillard shuffled slightly to his right, took the stethoscope from his ears, and handed it to Harold, who now resembled the ubiquitous deer caught in the headlights. "What do I do, sir?" Hampton was unnerved enough, so deep underground on the cusp of such a huge attack, that he was not entirely certain how he'd ended up in this bizarre situation. He would think about that later. Not the fear. He understood fear. It was the oddity of the sequence, the way one small order had become another, and then another, until he was kneeling in the dark with the German conversation pressed against his ears. "Plugs in the ears and take the discs, one in each hand, and try to center the sound from the other side. No more talking. We're running out of time." Gillard seemed nervous, and despite the whisper, his condition was betrayed. No one could have argued the fact that it was perfectly understandable in the circumstances. What you've just heard is based upon one of the least appreciated military achievements of the First World War. The Royal Engineer Tunnelling Company's transformed underground warfare. The British did hold several crucial advantages. The clay beneath Flanders could be cut silently using a technique known as clay kicking. Instead of swinging noisy pickaxes, the miners lay almost flat on their backs and drove a specialised spade into the clay, using the far greater strength of the legs, the quadricep muscles. Every spoil cart ran on self-oiling bearings by 1916. Every miner wore soft felt overshoes and steady, heavy, hobnailed boots. Silence became a weapon. The German tunnellers, by contrast, continued to excavate with pickaxes while wearing hobnail heavy boots that echoed through the galleries. This was not simply engineering. It was a battle of patience, discipline, and listening. Underground, the side that made the least noise often survived. In this ancient mode of warfare, which originated as far back as the 14th century with the undermining and mining of castles, the specialist tunnelling companies of mining engineers and, as stated previously, specialist miners undertook this skilled, dangerous, and often exhausting work. The evacuation of these mining tunnels often took months of unrelenting effort, with the continuous threat of discovery and utilisation by the enemy. Both sides maintained counter-mining squads with the express purpose of detecting and destroying the tunnels, along with the miners working in them. On occasion, violent hand-to-hand combat took place underground between the miners of the two sides. The more renowned of these tunnelling efforts were those which took place in 1916 at the Somme, in 1917 at Arras, and perhaps, as we've listened to, the most famous were those in the Messines sector. The Messines complex of tunnels stretched in an 8.5-mile or 14-kilometre arc from Hill 60 in the north to Plugstelt, or Plug Street, as the soldiers called it, Wood in the south. It was the original idea of Major Norton, although he had already left the tunnelling force before the explosions at Messines took place. In all, the Messines mines contained around 500 tons of explosive. The work demanded extraordinary discipline. The miners worked in complete darkness. Conversations became whispers. Often there were none at all, because somewhere beyond, only a few feet of clay another group of miners might already be listening. History tends to celebrate the men who charged over the top. Far fewer people remember those who spent years beneath the battlefield, digging, fighting, and dying to make victory possible. Without the tunnellers, there would have been no Messines. And now for a question. Imagine spending every working day above ground, in the trenches, in the noise, and then suddenly you're thousands of yards underground in almost complete silence, knowing that the enemy might only be a few feet away. What would you fear most? The darkness, the location, or the fact that the enemy was only inches away from you? The next episode is entitled 0310, when across the Messines Ridge the detonating mines would ensure that a private soldier would carry with him the single most important intelligence leak in human history and never understand what he had heard. For a detailed dossier on the Battle of Messines, go to DiFanteriaBooks.com, the Author's Reading Room, and pick up the volume from the shelf. It's right there for you. All of the detail is in it for you to explore. Until next time, thank you for joining me in the reading room. I am Janos Di-Fanteria, and this is Authors.